Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this very timely and insightful conversation with Professor Sahar Aziz on her new book, The Racial Muslim: When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom. My name is Mubashir Tazamul. I'm a senior research fellow at the Bridge Initiative, and I'll be moderating today's conversation. I'll briefly introduce Professor Aziz and her book, and then we'll go into a 50-minute discussion between myself and her. And then we'll open it up to an audience Q&A for about 20 minutes. So do drop in your questions to the Q&A function. A little bit about Professor Sahar Aziz. She's the Professor of Law, Chancellor, Social Justice Scholar, and Middle East and Legal Studies Scholar at Rutgers University Law School. Professor Aziz's scholarship adopts an interdisciplinary approach to examine intersections of national security, race, and civil rights with a focus on the adverse impact of national security laws and policies on racial, ethnic, and religious minorities in the U.S. She's the founding director of the interdisciplinary Rutgers Center for Security, Race, and Rights. She's also the faculty affiliate of the African American Studies Department at Rutgers University and a member of the Rutgers New York Chancellor's Commission on Diversity and Transformation. Professor Aziz is an editor for the Arab Law Quarterly and the International Journal of Middle East Studies. Professor Aziz also teaches courses on national security, critical race theory, Islamophobia, evidence, torts, and Middle East law. A little blurb about her book. Today in the post 9/11 era, we are witnessing a type and degree of profiling and targeting of Muslims that more closely resembles racial discrimination historically experienced by African Americans, Native Americans, and Asian American communities of all faiths. Hence, Muslims are being treated as a race, and more specifically, a suspect race, rather than as a religious minority to be protected from persecution. For that reason, government officials and members of the public, who may attest their belief in religious freedom, do not view targeting Muslims in national security and immigration practices as a threat to religious freedom. In her book, The Racial Muslim: When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom, Professor Aziz explores this paradox: how a religious minority could be so overtly discriminated against in a country that privileges religious freedom legally and normatively. The answers illuminate both racial contours of religious freedom in American law and society. I wanted to begin with some quick thoughts after I read the book, and I can honestly say I cannot recommend this book enough, not just for individuals interested in Islamophobia, but also American history, immigration, racism, and white supremacy. The Racial Muslim is rich in historical context as it interrogates the experiences of different communities such as Jews, Catholics, and Mormons, and how they sought to be accepted into the American national fabric and what that process looked like. And in this book, Professor Aziz fills in a gap in academic literature by highlighting the interconnectedness of both race and religion in forming American identity. She looks into who is American and who is guaranteed full protections and rights under the Constitution. Throughout her book, she provides examples and historical evidence to defend her argument that religious freedom in the US has always been circumscribed by race. Professor Aziz argues that America's commitment to religious freedom has always been racially constrained to those categorized as white and Christian. Religion is racialized based on American national identity that is rooted in colonialism, xenophobia, and anti-Black racism. Throughout US history, neither race nor religion exists in isolation, but interacts to produce a racier religious hierarchy. And religion has played a foundational role in the construction of race and whiteness in America. And religious freedom is not available to all equally. And in the case of Muslims, this community is treated like a suspect race and not a religious minority. And in the US, Islam is placed in the realm of politics and not religion. So with that brief overview, we'll jump into the Q&A. So my first question, Professor Aziz, is I'd like to talk about whiteness and how you define this in your book, specifically noting the interconnectedness of race and religion. Can you expand on this and also talk about the Black-white paradigm that is foundational to American society?
Well, first, I want to thank you so much, Mubashir, for inviting me, and thank you to Georgetown University and for the Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding, to Dr. John Esposito, who's the founder and director, and to everyone who's taking time out of their busy schedules to attend the book talk today. It's truly a privilege to be here. So the book, as you gave a very concise introduction. Thank you for that. The book is written by someone who is a critical race theorist. That would be me. And therefore, I am attempting to apply critical race theories to understanding that paradox of why a religious minority in a country that privileges religious freedom in its laws, in its constitution, in the First Amendment, in statutory laws, the Religious Land Use and Incarcerated Persons Act, in the Religious Freedom and Restoration Act, in Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and so on and so forth, where we have multiple laws that support this normative belief in protecting against religious persecution and against religious discrimination. And yet what we're seeing is very open and rabid Islamophobia that's acceptable, that is not in any way as shameful as being, for example, anti-Black, or as being anti-Semitic, or as being anti-Asian. And so the question is why does our country accept that? Why does such a large number of our population accept that and not see that as a contradiction? And so it's oftentimes the answer tends to be very reductivist, or people who proffer answers tend to be very reductivist about, oh, it's just religious bigotry. But it's much more than that, because to understand how systemic bias and systemic discrimination against groups operates in the US historically and in the contemporary era, you have to understand the role of race. And race is a social construction, right? It is whatever we decide it to be. We make up the names of the races, such as Black or white or brown or Mexican, oftentimes conflating national origin with a racial category. We also decide as a society who fits into those categories and what the criteria is. So one very arbitrary criteria is if you have one drop of Black blood, whatever that is, you're Black. Now, there is a rationale historically to that, which was slavery, so that it was essentially in support of slave owners' capitalist economic interests to have as many slaves as possible. And so that if there was ever any intermixing at all, including when the white slave owning master raped his female Black slaves, whatever children were born would be slaves. But that has continued even when slavery was prohibited. And so we always have to interrogate these categories, what is race, and why do we use this name, this particular label for this particular race, and what criteria do we use to say these people are in this race and not in that race? And then finally, what's the consequences? What's the material and dignitary consequences of being raced in a particular category? And so if someone says you're white, or you self-identify as white and that's accepted, or Black, or Arab, or Muslim, which I'll talk about in a second, or Jewish, or Catholic, what does that mean? And does it mean, and oftentimes, if it's not white, it usually has negative consequences. It usually means that you will not experience and benefit from the full panoply of individual rights and collective rights that are stated in our laws, in our US Constitution, in our state constitutions. Not that it says in the law we are intentionally discriminating against these groups. It is that in practice, in society, because of the way that we've been socialized to categorize people by race and treat them accordingly, worse or better, then they have a very different lived experience. So whiteness is a social construction, just like Blackness is. And what it is today is not the same as what it was 250 years ago, 200 years ago, even 100 years ago. You know, historically, white was, again, socially constructed, but it really was defined, it was very narrowly defined by people who were from Northwest Europe, people who were Anglo-Saxon origin primarily, and people who were Protestant. And as a result, those were considered, you know, the first-class citizens in a broad normative sense, and also in a legal sense. But those were the people who would get the benefits of being these first-class citizens, which include being presumed to be competent, being presumed to be good, being good in terms of moral, being presumed to be innocent, and all of these positive presumptions that you would lose those presumptions based on your individual behavior, but you would have to do something to lose them. Whereas when you're a minority, it's the flip of it. If you're presumed to be certain negative characteristics that's associated with your particular racialization category, and then you individually have to try to prove otherwise, which you may or may not be successful depending on the context. So whiteness has been reconstructed over time because in the late 1800s, starting in the late 1800s and then going into at least the 1930s, you had over 36 million immigrants in a country that was only around 60 million people. So this is almost 50% of the population that is now immigrants or children of immigrants. And the vast majority of those people came from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe and from Ireland. There were two waves of migration from Ireland. The first was in the early 1800s, and then the second was along with the Eastern European Jews and the Italian Catholics. And so the majority of these 36 million people were not Protestant, and they were not Northwest European. And if they were, it was the Irish, which were actually considered inferior within current day UK context, because we all know about the conflict between the Irish and the English, and that does have racial undertones, or excuse me, religious undertones. So as a result, those people, they were legally white, but they weren't socially white. They were these in-between races. They weren't seen or treated or perceived as inferior as Blacks, which were considered the most inferior in the US social racial hierarchy, but they were not equal to the Northwestern European Anglo-Saxon Protestant, quote, Americans. Mm-hmm. And there is an entire kind of history of how whiteness was expanded to eventually include them, which I can go into the details later in our discussion, such that today in 2022, there's no question that someone whose ancestry is from Italy, or ancestry is from Eastern Europe, or ancestry is from Ireland, and they're also Catholic or Jewish, there's no question that they're white. Everybody knows they're white. They treat them as if they're white, and they're white legally, and they have the privileges of whiteness, as compared to someone whose ancestry is from Central America, or the Middle East and North Africa, or from South Asia, or Far East Asia, or Sub-Saharan Africa, right? When we're thinking about immigrants' experiences. And that is a really important story that I think we just have to unpack and understand, so that we can also understand the complexities of the racialization of Muslims over the last century.
And you do that fantastically throughout your book. For our audience listening, everything that Dr. Aziz has hit on, talking about Jews and talking about Catholics, and then talking about Eastern Europeans or Southern Europeans and Irish, you go into each of these groups and how they were perceived when they first came into the US socially. But going along this line, you also talk about how there was a time where ethnicity was used. And so what is the difference between ethnicity and race, and how did ethnicity play a role in the reconstruction of white?
It's a really fascinating kind of transformation. And much of it is rooted and based in the experiences, again, of these tens of millions of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe who are not Protestant. So as they come, they are oftentimes, many of them are economic refugees. Mm-hmm. They're coming because there is extreme famine or poverty, or in the case of Eastern European Jews, there are certain ways of them that are coming to escape the pogroms and what is current day Russia and former Soviet Union. And they come here and they have very little. And they're also treated very poorly because they are not fully white, socially white. And they tend to live in tenements in New York City and other large cities. They tend to be in these very poor, low-income enclaves, and they're experiencing significant forms of discrimination, from employment discrimination, from being able to get into certain universities, including Ivy Leagues, from being even able to live in certain neighborhoods. And they're experiencing, and as a result, they're also experiencing poverty. And they want to get out of that, right? Because they came to the US, like the vast majority of immigrants who come for economic reasons, to live a more prosperous economic life. And so their religious identity, and they're coupled with their ancestry, which we would now think of as national origin or ethnicity, is impeding them from doing so. And the reason is because they're being racialized. Now, race, in contrast to ethnicity, has always been treated in American society as this quasi or absolute biological trait. So when you are raced as Black, for example, the racism that results, or the manifestation, is that you are indelibly, you are biologically inferior. Right? This is the historical social construction of Blackness. And all of the stereotypes come with that you are inherently lazy, you are inherently violent, you are inherently less intelligent, right? It's as if you have these genetic flaws that you could never overcome no matter what you did. And therefore you belong in the lower rungs of society, economically, politically, socially. And again, Blackness has always been at the very bottom of the hierarchy. But immigrants have tried, when they come, they want to climb up that hierarchy because they're told very early on, including until today, that if you are white, if you're accepted as white, you have a chance of having the full benefits, political, social, and economics. And so there is oftentimes a competition among immigrants to try to fall into the model minority, right? To try to pass as white, act as white, dress as white, whatever white means at that particular moment in time. But again, it's always been associated and continues to be associated with Northwest European norms and culture, and now has expanded more into Europe writ large, right? Because these groups of people, right, the Italians, the Eastern European Jews, the Irish Catholics, were trying to prove that no, we are not inferior, right? We are, and they wanted to show that they were willing to assimilate into this Anglo-Saxon Protestant normativity. And so what happened is there was a shift in how their identity was differentiated. Is instead of being a certain race, which was also the common parlance during the era of eugenics in the early, the first 2 to 3 decades of the 20th century. And then as eugenics was starting to become debunked, and as the children of these immigrants and the grandchildren of these immigrants were starting to slowly and through much effort become socially mobile, they were starting to identify as ethnic whites. So we're white, yes, we are different, but it's our ethnicity, which is kind of similar to what we think of as national origin today. And that gives you agency. That makes you say, I can define what it means to be an Italian or an American of Italian descent. I can define what it means to be an American of Irish descent. I can define what it means if I'm originally from what is current day, Belarus or Ukraine or Lithuania or Russia. And therefore, if I assimilate and if I change how I live and I don't speak a foreign language anymore, and I move into neighborhoods where it's primarily upper white middle class, and I essentially try to just pass into whiteness and expand that definition, then I'm no longer threatening. Then Italian, being of Italian origin, is actually endearing because, oh, we love pizza and we love spaghetti and we love the Italian, music. And now it's no longer a threat that you're here to take our jobs. You're here to, you have no sense of, you're not liberal, because politics has always been something that's been used to racialize immigrants, which is to say you're illiberal, you're anti-democratic, you are uncivilized, right? You are incapable of self-governance. And all of that is in contrast to the American kind of exceptionalist identity that this country is the land of pure democracy, right? The land of pure liberalism and self-governance. And therefore all these people that are coming from these, what we think of as inferior lands, they are going to corrupt our culture. They're going to corrupt our society and make it illiberal and anti-democratic. So this switch from race to ethnicity gave these groups of people. At this point, you're now into, as I said, you're into children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, some agency. And ultimately, so they went from these in-between races during the era of eugenics to ethnic whites during the 1940s, 1950s, and then the Cold War hits, and suddenly the US needs to prove to all of the countries that it wants in its sphere of influence and competition with communism, right, with the Soviet Union. It wants to prove that we are a tolerant country. We do believe in pluralism. We are not religious bigots, and we are not racist. And so they start to, the government, it starts to become a concerted effort politically and through media to define American national identity, expand it to be Judeo-Christian. And that then says, oh, it's okay if you are of Italian origin or, you know, these different parts of Europe. However, the line still was drawn, the line essentially expanded from Northwest Europe, you know, figuratively and literally, to all of Europe. It still excluded other countries, and that was reflected in immigration laws. So now it's white. So you go in between races, ethnic whites, and then just fully socially white. And I just want to note, all of these are social trends, not legal trends, because all of them were legally white. Because interestingly, notwithstanding all of this, you know, these hierarchical, social hierarchical differentiations, if you were from Europe, you were always legally white.
Yeah. Going into that, also, you touch on your book, actually, when you're explaining all of this, the impact of international events had on how American national identity and whiteness was built or expanded and molded and reshaped. So it wasn't just domestic things, that absolutely international events such as the Cold War, World War II played a big role in how certain communities became accepted into whiteness. So we've touched on the Judeo-Christian identity. And so you've talked a lot about, you know, Irish Catholics and Jews from Eastern Europe. How do today's immigrant Muslims' experiences mirror and differ from those of Jewish, Catholic, and Mormon communities a century earlier?
Right. So I want to just note that the other effort, well, one of the factors that contributed to the expansion of American national identity from being a white Protestant nation to being a white Judeo-Christian nation is the concerted and long-term efforts, coalition efforts and lobbying and collective mobilization of progressive Protestants and Catholics and Jews that created an organization called the NCJS, the National Committee, National Association of Catholics, Jews, and Protestants, and our National Association of Christian Jews Society. They went around, it was essentially a rabbi, a priest, and a pastor who went around the country and mobilized and organized to try to show that these three religions had much more in common than they had apart, and that it was un-American, right, to be anti-Semitic, and it was un-American to be anti-Catholic. And the way that anti-Catholicism was expressed was that Catholics couldn't be democratic with a small d. They couldn't be liberal. They were unfit for self-governance because their first and only loyalty was to the Pope, who was abroad. And therefore, when they come here, we can't trust them. We can't trust that they're going to be loyal first and foremost to the nation, the United States. And that was a stereotype that they needed to overcome, whether they were German Catholics, whether they were Italian Catholics, right, whether they were Irish Catholics. And similarly with Jews, many of us are quite familiar with all the different anti-Semitic tropes, which is that they are clannish, that they are untrustworthy, that there's always some form of conspiracy, that they're trying to take over the world, that they're only loyal to each other, and they're more loyal to global Jewry rather than the nation that they live in. So the Jews and the Catholics were struggling to try to figure out, how do we overcome these stereotypes, and how do we get Americans to trust us and trust that when we're here and we've lived here and our kids lived here and we've resettled here permanently, we are loyal to the country. And so that's where they found partners also with what we would consider progressive Protestants. And that was ultimately successful. Now, again, that was what was happening at the domestic level. But internationally, the Cold War, you cannot underestimate two major events in terms of the the whitening, the social whitening of Jews and Catholics, which is the Holocaust, right? World War II and the Holocaust, and the Cold War. Because those two events caused the US to change its foreign policy and then have to also be consistent in changing its domestic policy. So by failing, for example, to provide refuge for Jews who were escaping the concentration camps, that there was kind of a debt to be paid. There was a lot of national guilt, rightfully so. And then also when the Cold War happened, as I said just earlier, there was pressure from abroad because many of the countries that they wanted influence over were Catholic. They were in Central America, they were in South America, right? And so in order for them to go and tell them, you should be on our side, not on these godless pagan communist side, they couldn't have anti-Catholicism running rampant in the United States, right? That was going to create a problem for them in their foreign policy. So those two things, in addition to this domestic effort, really helped to, and also just the third, fourth, fifth generation, the natural progression of kind of coercive assimilation of the immigrants. So then when you look at Muslims, when you understand that history, you realize, this is almost part of the immigrant curse. Is you come here and you are, again, unless you're from a very select part of the world in Europe, you come here and your accent, the way you look, the way you dress, your language is oftentimes a liability socially. It's oftentimes something that is used to justify that you are not equal, right? That you are less intelligent, less hardworking, less trustworthy, less loyal. And with Muslims, there was no exception. Now, the interesting thing about immigrants who are Muslim and is how they got here and where they came from. So the majority of them, now the Muslim majority world is very large. There's 1.8 billion Muslims in the world. It's the second largest religion. And the two countries that actually have the largest populations of Muslims is India, which is not a Muslim majority country, but because it's such a large country that it's 14% of Muslims come out to, more than 120 million, I believe, Muslims, which is more than the largest Muslim majority country, which is Egypt, and maybe Iran is a close second. You also have Indonesia, which is a Muslim majority country. And I'm not specific on the population size, but I think it's nearing 100 million, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, most of the people who were coming from, that were Muslim, were coming from the Middle East and North Africa. Right? That's really where most of them were coming. When did they really start coming in beyond just a few hundred or a few thousand? After 1965, because that's when the immigration laws, there were these quotas that were set in 1924 as a direct, and the quotas were specifically to stop the immigration of Italian Catholics, Irish Catholics, and Eastern European Jews. That was and there were already Asian Exclusion Acts that excluded Asians starting in 1882 with the Chinese Exclusion Act. But the white Protestants, the Northwest European Protestants, did not want any more of these low class or in between races from coming. And they passed quotas, national origin quotas, and said, we're going to look at the 1890 census, and we're only going to allow 2% of however many, say, Italians there were in America in 1890, which is before the large wave. Only 2% of that's the quota for how many people from Italy can now immigrate to the US. So what you had is a Northwest Europeanization of the immigrant population from 1924 until 1965. The Asian Exclusion Acts start to be repealed in 1943. In 1954, you start having laws that allow non-whites to naturalize, because there also were immigration laws, long-standing immigration laws, that did not allow any immigrant to naturalize to become a US citizen unless they were white, and that was in the law. So people that were from China originally, or people that were from any non-European country, could not naturalize to become US citizens. Only their children could be US citizens because of the 14th Amendment, right? So with Muslims, you have this, they really can't even get here before 1965. because they're considered, for the most part of Asia or part of Africa. And I can talk a little bit about the Levantines that came before 65, which is a really interesting history. But post 65 is when you start seeing people who are Muslim in large numbers. And that's then when then their racialization happens. And so the question is, what is it that's causing their racialization? Well, some of the things is similar to what was happening with other immigrant communities. The way they look, right? So the darker skinned you are, the more curly your hair is, your facial features, the more African you look, or the more Asian you look, or the more South Asian or Indian you look, then the less white you are, and therefore you will be in the hierarchy, right? And if you're darker skin, you go down in the hierarchy. If you're lighter skin, you go up in the hierarchy. Similar if you have an accent, if you dress in a way that's seen as foreign. And when you're a new immigrant, it's very different than when you're born and raised in the US, because you've been formed culturally and socially in a different country. And so those languages, those cultural norms, that's what's natural to you. And then the international events affect you. So, and this has always happened, right? This has always happened to immigrants, is whenever, for example, if you look at World War I and particularly, and World War II as well, actually, is the Italian immigrants and the German immigrants were treated with suspicion, and some of them were even deported simply because their country was at war with the US, right? So you have the Alien Sedition Act. Similarly with World War I and World War II, many Jews were suspected of being communists because they were from Eastern Europe, and some Jews were communists, right? And some non-Jews were communists. But being communist in America during that era was, we had the Bolshevik Revolution, was something that the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover's FBI, was looking for in order to incarcerate you or to deport you. So with Muslims, you then think about what's happening abroad in Muslim majority countries. So the events that I talk about, I'm happy to unpack, as we go through the conversation. But the key events that gradually racialize Muslim identity is the creation of Israel in 1948, the Arab-Israeli War in 1967, the Arab oil embargo in 1973, the Iranian Islamic Revolution in 1979, the first Gulf War in 1991, and then the Trade Center bombing in 1993. And then finally you get 9/11, which just essentially takes a process that had been gradually getting worse, but would kind of ebb and flow, and made it permanent. So that then Muslim identity became permanently racialized. And it's kind of, think of the reversal from ethnicity to race. Now you have from race to ethnicity. Now you have ethnicity to race. Now they're a race, they're treated as a race. They're not actually a race, but they're treated as a race such that their identity, their religious identity, imputes upon them these biological traits. What are those biological traits? I mean, I'm saying figuratively, that they are disloyal, that they are prone to violence, that they are sympathetic to terrorist groups, that they are vulnerable to joining terrorist groups, and that they're anti-democracy, that they're misogynistic, that they're illiberal, and that they're anti-Semitic, right? That's another Islamophobic trope, because whatever's happening abroad in the Arab-Israeli conflict, which is a political conflict, right, over land, then that then becomes imputed onto them, as if, well, just by virtue of having any connection to the Arab world or any connection to Islam, even though Palestinians are both Christian and Muslim in large parts. I mean, there's not just a small Palestinian Christian minority, it's a significant number of Palestinians who are Christian, then suddenly you must hate all Jews, right? So that's also something that's paradoxically kind of used as part of the Islamophobic trope. And each time these events would happen, these international crisis events, which the US was involved in one way or the other through its foreign policy and during the Cold War, the media would just have an influx of negative stereotypes. It would have an influx of images of Muslims and Arabs who are, again, always conflated together, as if Arab Christians didn't exist, as if Arab Jews didn't exist, as if Arab Baha'is, well, Baha'is are primarily in Iran, but there's Arab Baha'is as well, as if Zoroastrians, there's so many different faiths, and even among the Christians, there's the Catholics, there's the Orthodox, there are there's the Protestants. All of that just gets erased and homogenized into one large monolithic negative stereotype. That's how racialization works. That's exactly what racialization does to a group, is it homogenizes it in a way that's adverse to their interest, dignitarily and materially. And so it would ebb and it would flow, and it would ebb and it would flow. And so people, depending on where they lived in the country, depending on whether they were first generation immigrants or second, or first generation Americans or second generation Americans, they would be able to kind of deal with that based on how they performed their identity, how they dressed, what environment they were in. And they had a little bit more agency. And then it would oftentimes get much better and kind of go dormant. It would be there, but it would be dormant because the news cycle would move on. Mm-hmm. But 9/11 completely transformed that.
Mm-hmm. This goes right into my next question about the racialization of Muslims being grounded in, you talk a lot about what you call the racio-religious hierarchy, as opposed to just a racial hierarchy. And you identify the racial Muslim as a fluid construct that's constantly negotiated by the interplay of four factors: white Protestant supremacy, coercive assimilation and xenophobia, European and American Orientalism, and American empire in Muslim majority countries. Can you outline that racial Muslim hierarchy for us and explain how you categorize it as most to least dangerous in the eyes of the state?
So oftentimes when scholars or advocates are explaining or discussing kind of the effects of racialization, is they tend to say, well, there's always the good Muslim and the bad Muslim, or the good Black and the bad Black, or the good woman and the bad woman. And it's defined based on what society thinks you should be behaving like, and society thinks you should not behave like, right? And the fact that you have those types of pressures to perform your identity in ways that members of the majority don't have, again, is evidence of a hierarchy. Right? That if you use just gender as an example, men have a lot more leeway to behave and dress and act and do as they please without that all being imputed upon all men. Mm-hmm. Right? Whereas with women, we're constantly having to try to prove that we don't have our behavior and our dress and the way we talk and who we marry and how we live our life doesn't cause people to think that we are a bad woman, right? Whatever that means in that context, because there's always a bad woman in every cultural context. And that is patriarchy, right? That's sexism. So similarly, when you're examining a group that is being, in this case, racialized, you have to acknowledge that there are always going to be people who will come and say, well, it didn't happen to me. I don't know what you're talking about. I love being here. I'm not experiencing bad things. And so the question is, that may very well be true as a matter of fact, but why? And so ask, well, why do we have one person or a group of people here and another group of people here that are all within the same identity, the same racialized identity, but they're having different experiences based, in connection with that identity? And that's where you get into things like coercive assimilation. Like, what's the price you have to pay, the tax you have to pay to belong, to try to shield yourself from the discrimination, right? The double standards, the contradictions, the hypocrisy, that, in other words, that people, members of the majority or people with power, don't have to experience when they engage in exactly the same type of behavior. Mm-hmm. And what I'm arguing is using just the good bad is not, it's too reductivist, and it doesn't accurately describe, at least within the racialization of Muslims, and I would argue actually within any kind of what we call subordinated group in critical race theory, it really is more hierarchical than it is dichotomous. And so then you have to ask, well, who is it, which subgroup, right? There's many subgroups that tends to be the most racialized or harmed the most from the racialization process. And then who's below them, and who's the least. And I've been working on these issues for 21 years now, or more than 20 years. And so I've been an advocate, I've been a lawyer, I've been, I worked for the government, and now I'm a professor and a scholar. And what I have found, based on kind of the facts that I'm privy to, is that when you want to know who has been harmed the most by the racialization of Muslims post 9/11, it is often the subgroup that is religious and dissident. So if that individual is pious and practicing, or what we call Orthodox Muslim, just for lack of a better term. You could be Orthodox Sunni, you can be Orthodox Shia, but you practice the faith in a very devout and pious way, which tends for a woman, for example, to translate into she wears the headscarf. Maybe for a man, he will grow a beard, right? That they go to prayer, they pray regularly, they fast in Ramadan regularly, they want to go to the pilgrimage in Mecca. I mean, they are practicing, and who they socialize with. They don't drink alcohol, they don't eat pork, they need those accommodations at work and at school because this is their lifestyle. Okay. Mm-hmm. And they're also political dissidents vis-a-vis whatever is mainstream at that time. And oftentimes when their dissidence is based on US foreign policy in Muslim majority country is when they get targeted the most. So if they are against the US occupying Iraq in 2003, if they are against the US occupying Afghanistan and nation building for more than 20 years, which obviously was an utter failure. So it's separate from attacking Afghanistan in legitimate self-defense against 9/11, but actually going in there and occupying the whole country and taking it over. Or you are opposed to the US's position on the Arab-Israeli conflict, right? You think that America is too one-sided, that they are too pro-Israeli, and that the American government does not in any way care about the human rights of Palestinians. Right? So that would be a critique. Similarly, you could be a political dissident, or for example, you don't think that it was appropriate for the U.S. to support what was effectively a military coup in Egypt, right? Or that you are opposed to the U.S. supporting the myriad dictators in the Middle East that get direct monetary, political, and military aid from the U.S., right? And you are opposed to that. So if you combine those two things together, you tend to be the first in line to be subjected to the state's national security apparatus, which it ranges from being surveilled to being selectively targeted for deportation or looking for any kind of immigration violations, to being subject to a sting operation and a counterterrorism plot that's fake. So they send undercover agents and informants to try to trap you into something so that they can incarcerate you, to being subject to secondary screening and frisking at airports, and other forms of religious profiling. And so the list kind of goes on. And then that's also the image that the public sees to say, oh, so it's okay for us to suspect them. It's okay for us to call them names. It's okay for us to be uncivil towards them. It's okay for us to do things and behave in ways that contradict religious freedom norms that we proclaim to believe in. And then in fact, if we're conservative Christians and evangelical Christians, we actually think that our religious freedoms are under attack. And whether you want to look at the debate over abortion or the debate over same-sex marriage, right? There are all sorts of culture wars going on right now that are centered around religious freedom debates and the role of religion in public life. So those same people, many of the people within that kind of subgroup of American society, hold very negative views in poll after poll, around 50 to 70 percentile. If they're Trump supporters, it usually comes up to 70 percentile in having unfavorable views of Muslims. They don't trust them. They don't want them as neighbors. They don't think they should be elected in office. They don't think they should be the president of the US. I mean, it's very open and very explicit. And yet they're also the same people who claim, well, my religious freedom rights or religious freedom in America is being eroded. And they don't seem to make that connection. It's like, why can't you not want for them what you want for yourself? Because you see them as an inferior race. You don't see them as a legitimate religion, which has roots in Orientalism, and it has roots in, interestingly, also anti-Mormonism. So the way that anti-Mormonism was characterized in the late 1800s and early 1900s was they were called the Muhammadan Turks because they practiced polygamy. And polygamy, from the Protestant perspective, was considered a savage, uncivilized practice. And so they saw the Mormons, who interestingly, so the Mormons were primarily from Scandinavian, Anglo, and Northwest Europe, and they were Anglo-Saxon. So phenotypically, the way they looked was, there was no question that they, quote, looked white at that time, right? In contrast to people from Southern or Eastern Europe, they actually did look different than people from Northwest Europe. So there were racial markers that you could see based on their hair color or their facial features or their height or their skin tone. But with Mormons, they pretty much looked the same as Protestants, but their religion is what quote unquote blackened them, right, within the racial hierarchy. And the fact that they were compared to Muhammadan Turks is very telling, because at the time, part of European Orientalism that was then imported into the US is that Islam was not this illegitimate religion. It was this religion of savages. It was a religion of despots that were licentious, misogynistic, and many of these stereotypes continue until today. They're either, they just kind of, they can be sometimes very explicit or sometimes veiled, thinly veiled in other forms of language. But Islam has always been kind of this foil against quote unquote Western Christendom, and that originates from Europe, and then that was brought here, and now we have it as you have American Orientalism, and then you have full-blown Islamophobia post 9/11.
Yeah, I found the part about talking about Mormonism, and that was fascinating, because the way they framed them, and then talking about seeing how far back this idea that Islam is not a valid religion, it's a false religion, and that sort of argument that we hear today of now it's more of Islam as a political ideology, not religion. But seeing how far back that goes was fascinating to see, because it's not a new argument. It's rooted, it has historical roots, and it was used against another community. I found that very, very fascinating.
Let me just finish. I'm sorry, I didn't finish the hierarchy. So it starts with the religious dissident, and then it goes down to the religious. So if you're religious but mainstream politically or apolitical, you're still a target. You're still suspected, because by virtue of being religious, that means your loyalties are in question, right? Your national loyalties and your loyalties or affiliation or affinity towards terrorist groups abroad is still in question. And then after that, you have the secular dissident. So those are people who are highly secular, and they're very open about that in terms of their lifestyle. There's no question that they're secularized, but they're dissident, especially on foreign policy. And then there are those who are both secular and mainstream politically or apolitical. And those tend to be the closest you'll get to kind of the good Muslim. And those are the people that people will point to and say, well, I'm friends with this person. I'm friends with Muslims. I'm not Islamophobic. And that person, not coincidentally, tends to not have an accent, tends to dress in Western wear, tends to not wear the hijab if she's a female, tends to not be practicing, tends to support either, mainstream Democratic Party or mainstream Republican Party, or isn't political at all, and tends to think that America is the best thing that's ever happened, and that whatever's wrong with it is very minimal. So there's no problems here. And they're okay. Well, we'll let you in. You've met the coercive assimilationist rules. And then finally, there's the former Muslim. And the former Muslim is essentially weaponized by many Islamophobic groups. There's an entire Islamophobia industry. There's books that have been written about it, which I cite in my book. There's also a report by the Center for American Progress called Fear Inc. and Fear Inc. 2.0. And I know the Bridge Initiative at Georgetown has done a lot of work on the Islamophobia industry, including your excellent work, Mubashara. But these groups look for spokespersons that can be the cover of their Islamophobic agenda. So they tend to find oftentimes women who have converted out of the faith, who will then go and make a lot of money. This is very profitable because they will pay them to write books, to go on book tours, and validate that Islam is misogynistic, and validate that Islam is violent and anti-Semitic, and prone to produce terrorism, and that mosques should be under surveillance, and that any religious Muslim is not a good Muslim. Right? Just by virtue of being religious means that you are flawed, you're inferior, and you're dangerous. Right? You're suspect. So that's also within the hierarchy.
So I also want to talk about this, and you touch on this on your book, about the experience of Black Muslims and how their experiences and their history in the country are very different from immigrant Muslims. If you could touch on that a bit, and then also talk about how did African Americans' adoption of Islam as a liberation ideology make them the targets of the US government?
Great question. So when I wrote this book, it was a very difficult book to write for multiple reasons. And one of the crossroads that I had to kind of figure out was how to talk about Muslims in America in a way that does justice to the diversity of experiences. Because Muslims in America are the most diverse racially, ethnically, immigrant status, you know, by all sorts of categories, the most diverse faith community. There is about 30% that are from the Middle East, North Africa. There's about 30% that are from South Asia, the South Asian kind of subcontinent, and 30% that are African American. And then the other 10%, you have 5% that are Latinx, and that's the most. Latinx communities are actually the largest growing Muslims in America in terms of people who are converting to Islam. And then you have 5% that are mixed and multiracial and other. And so a third of Muslims in America are African American, and that's a significant population. The book, my book, The Racial Muslim, When Racism Questions Religious Freedom, is very intentionally, and I say this up front, about immigrant Muslims who came post-1965. And the reason I had to kind of make that decision is because the history of Islam within African-American communities is very different and very unique vis-a-vis or as compared to those who are of Middle East, North African, or South Asian descent. First and foremost is that Islam came to the US in the 1600s through the arrival of enslaved Africans who were, it's estimated, because the scholars can't find definitive numbers, but the estimates are about 30% of enslaved Africans were Muslim. Islam had been in West Africa for hundreds of years, along with many other religions. And so people who were being abducted, kidnapped, sold from West Africa, you know, many of them were Muslims, and they came from Muslim families, and they practiced Islam similar to Islam being practiced in other parts of the world. But because when they came, by being Muslim or not being Christian, that was considered just another more evidence that they were heathen, that they were savage. And all of these enslaved Africans were prohibited from practicing any religion. In fact, they were eventually forced to convert to Christianity, to Protestantism more specifically. And therefore, they had to practice in secret. And they got caught, they would be beaten. And there are some excellent books about that history that, again, I cite in my book that do justice to that rich history, right? And then there is a phase where, you know, at some point when the slave trade is banned around 1808, and no new enslaved Africans can be brought to the US, but slavery is still legal in the US. That's when you see you don't have people coming in anymore who are practicing, whether it's Islam or some other faith. And it's almost impossible. I'm not saying it's impossible, because there are communities, there were some enslaved Africans who were able to retain, right, their Muslim identity, their Muslim practices. But just remember, slaves would be sold off. Again, they would be beaten if they were practicing Islam or any other faith. They would be forced to convert, so they had to even pretend that they were Christian. And so when you have from 1808 onward, at some point that last generation that came dies out, and if they're not able to pass on, right, Islamic lessons and Islamic how to pray and how to fast and all the norms, then it is under threat of being almost extinct. Now, many of these practices, interestingly, were incorporated, right, into even the way, along with other African religions, that were incorporated in how African Americans practiced and arguably today practice Christianity. But that is very different than what happens when you have people coming around 1965 from Muslim majority countries. Now, where African American identity and Islam, another kind of point of contact that an activity is in the early 1900s, where the Nation of Islam is created, where the Moorish temple is created by Drew Ali. And these are kind of a combination of Black nationalist groups that then identify, I mean, you could say appropriate, misappropriate, but certainly identify with some kind of Islamic notion or Islamic identity to say that we're not white, we are Moors, right? or we're not Christian. We came from Africa and many of our ancestors were Muslim. And so we are going to kind of take back our Muslim identity, and we will reject our slave master names and our slave master's religion. And so they would rebuke and say, we're not Christians anymore. They would rebuke their last names, as we see with, say, Malcolm X and many of the Nation of Islam members who used X intentionally. It was a form of resistance, right? Of having been the descendants of slaves and rejecting slavery and all of its and the legacies that continue to exist. But they identified themselves as Muslim. They were Black. They said, we're Nation of Islam, we're Muslim. Now, there are books, again, about the way in which the Nation of Islam practiced Islam. It was not in the same way. I mean, there were differences if you were to compare it to how Sunni Muslims in Muslim majority countries practice, or Shia Muslims. And so it was very much of an American project. And it was intertwined with politics, and it was intertwined with American racism, anti-Black racism. And then ultimately, there is then another transformation where not only does Malcolm X, when he goes to do his pilgrimage in Saudi Arabia in the 1960s, just before he's assassinated, he declares, I am a Sunni Muslim, right? And he leaves the Nation of Islam. And then Muhammadan Muhammad, who is the son of Elijah Muhammad, who was the leader of the Nation of Islam, he also then, after his father dies in the 1970s, he then declares that he's a Sunni Muslim, and the entire most of the Nation of Islam, I don't want to say converts, but changes its identity and says, we are now Sunni Muslims. And the practices also start to change and become more similar to the practices that you see in Muslim majority countries. Now, there was still a group of people who said, no, we're not, we're going to stick with what we think is the authentic Nation of Islam practices and political beliefs. And that's Louis Farrakhan's group, right? So it's really fascinating, but it's a very different history and it's a very different trajectory. And also African-American Muslims, whether they were Nation of Islam, whether they self-identified as Sunni or anything else, they were always Black first. Right? They were always Black first. And so they dealt with the same types of anti-Black racism that Black Christians dealt with. Mm-hmm. And they actually were considered a particularly dangerous type of Black, because the stereotypes they faced is that they were militant, that they were subversive. So there was certainly this suspicion of them being disloyal, but it was like they were the homegrown terrorists, right? They were the homegrown domestic security threats, whereas the immigrant Muslims from the Middle East and North Africa was very connected to the international, as we see even today with the post 9/11 stereotypes. And so it was these foreigners coming in and trying to subvert, just like the suspicions of Jews being communists, right? Coming in, just like the Italians being fascists, right? Everybody whenever you're an immigrant, you're always stereotyped in ways that are connected to international events vis-a-vis the US and your region or country of origin, whether you like it or not.
Yeah. This has been fascinating. I'm going to open up because we've got a few questions. So if you do have a question, please drop it into the Q&A. There's one question from one of the attendees who says, the far-right ideologies such as the Great Replacement theory have seemingly become front and center in movements that inspired events like the January 6th insurrection. As these racist ideals take a larger hold on public discourse, what role can or should the government take to curb such ideas from inciting more violence?
So this is a great question because, I just finished writing this book, and I learned a tremendous amount about American history when I was researching for this book, because I originally was intending to focus a lot more on post-1965 America. But in order to do justice, to really understand or be able to understand and explain the post-1965 context, I did need to go back in time by almost 100 years. And I remember being struck at the extent to which white nativism was at fever pitch in the first 2 decades of the 1900s. And it's a part of American history that we're really not taught much about in schools. We know about the KKK of the, before and during and after the Civil War, right? Especially after the Civil War. And we know about the KKK in the 1950s and 1960s, and well, even before that, of the lynchings of Blacks. So we are taught about the relationship between white supremacy as it's manifested, say, through the KKK and other groups, vis-a-vis anti-Black racism. But what's often not told or discussed enough is how the white nativist / white supremacist movement increased in size significantly to millions of members when in response to those millions of immigrants coming from Eastern and Southern Europe. And then they started to become, they were always anti-Black. And then they added Catholics and they added Jews and Asians, anyone who was immigrant. But at that time, most of those immigrants, again, were coming from these particular parts of the world. And so that has, and the logo was this, the motto was the same as it is today. These people are coming and they're going to Mongolize, they literally use the word here, they're going to Mongolize our bloodline, our race. We have a pure white race, and all of these brown people, again, if you're from Eastern or Southern Europe, you were considered dark, too dark. They're going to come and they're going to intermarry, and they're going to take over the government, and they're going to take over society, and they're going to replace us, and we are the superior race. And yes, it was most explicitly articulated in the KKK and white supremacist group, but there was always like more diffuse and deluge versions of that within mainstream society as well. So what we're seeing today is a repeat of history. The difference, at least from my vantage point of the research area, is now Muslims have also been added, as have other groups. But anti-Semitism has always been part of white supremacy, and it's theologically based. When you think about all of the different theological justifications of why the Jews killed Christ, the Jews drink the blood, that they kill babies. There's all kinds of awful stereotypes that are theologically based. I'm not saying they're true, and I'm not saying that all Christians believe that, but there is a theological component to it. So that's, I guess my answer is that we shouldn't be surprised. It's a repeat of history, and I think if you read my book, you'll find it. I'm trying to kind of find the specific answer here. But I think what we have to do, and I talk about this in the last chapter of the book, is how do Muslims respond to what's been happening to them, particularly those who came of age after 9/11. And then that also is connected to how other American youth who are just now becoming our leaders or about to become our leaders, how are they going to respond to the great replacement, the rise of right-wing extremism. And by the way, the reason why it's rising is because the demographics are changing radically. Same reason from 100 years ago. There will be no majority white race in 2050 and possibly 2040. In some parts of the country, there is no majority race, however we construct race, in California, in Texas. And therefore, power can, if the power and money and wealth and all of opportunity, all of the benefits of society, of citizenship, continue to be concentrated within one particular race, we're going to have a problem. We're going to have a minority-controlled country as opposed to a majoritarian-based country, or we're going to have to start spreading power and money and wealth and opportunity more equitably and actually practice meritocracy rather than claim that we practice meritocracy. And that's going to mean that people don't automatically get guaranteed simply because of the color of their skin that they're going to be middle class, that they're going to be upper middle class, that they have this entitlement to certain professions, and that at the cost and the expense of other groups who, if they make it, it's usually because they're twice as smart, 3 times as smart, twice as hardworking, 3 times as hardworking, right? It's not an equal playing field. They say, well, look, she made it, he made it. Well, go see how much work they had to do and how many credentials they had to have. And I can guarantee you it's a lot more than a lot of the so-called average if you come from the privileged class. And so that just shows it's not a meritocracy. So I think what the young people need to do is you guys need to come up with a new way. You need to, the first and foremost is you've got to overcome structural segregation. This society is structured in a way so that if you are of a different race and you are of a different class, you will not engage with each other. You will not talk to each other. You will not go to school with each other. You will not pray together. You will not live next to each other. You will not socialize together, because this is a highly segregated society, both within urban and rural areas. And that if we don't stop that, if we don't find ways to overcome that, whether it's at the policy level for housing and education and who goes to school where, or at the interpersonal level in having to go out of our way to meet people who don't necessarily live in our neighborhoods and go to our schools, then I think we are headed for a bleak future of racial polarization. And all of these people who elected Trump are going to be quite effective in dividing the country and growing white supremacy under some other name. And they're not going to call it white supremacy. They're going to call it Make America Great Again, right? They'll call it something else. But that's ultimately what it is, because MAGA is really MAWA. It's Make America White Again. That's what MAGA is.
That I also found when you talk about this, about what we're experiencing today, and when you read your book about almost, exactly 100 years ago, the way the KKK was in the country and the power that they held and the influence that they held and the public opinion, it's almost when I was reading it, it almost was surreal, because we're experiencing that to the T almost 100 years later. But so we have this is a very interesting question about European Muslims from the Balkans and the Caucasus. Would they not be racialized because they count as the favorable European country, or is it more about their level of practice, i.e. they're more secular and less associated with South Asian and MENA immigrants?
Yeah. So again, I think we do have to differentiate between the pre-1965 and then the 1965 to 2001 and then the post-2001. Many of the first Muslims who immigrated here, so not those who were descendants of enslaved Africans, but those who immigrated here, were from Eastern Europe. So the first mosque, I believe, was actually an Albanian mosque, or built by Albanian immigrants. And then you also have people from the Levant, although most of the immigrants from the Levant were Christian, and those that are current day Syria and Lebanon. And their numbers, the highest range is about 350,000, which is nothing compared to the tens of millions from Southern and Eastern Europe. But before then, to be honest, I didn't find much, and this is outside of my area of expertise in terms of understanding the unique history of the Albanian and Bosnian and kind of these Eastern European Muslim communities when they came to the US, because at that point, they certainly were not going to be racialized as white because they weren't Protestant. If you weren't Protestant and from Northwest Europe, you were not going to be socialized as white. So I think that's a really good area for further research of where did they fit in the hierarchy. If I had to speculate, it would be that they're probably within these in-between races. But again, Islam in that era was not considered a domestic threat. It was Europe's problem. This is before we get involved in the Middle East. This is pre-World War II. And it's, yes, European Orientalism is certainly in US literature and art, and you could read Edward Said's work, but it's very foreign. And it's not an immediate threat. It's not people taking your jobs or people living in your neighborhoods or people going to school with your kids. It's not that type of a threat, that a perceived threat. Now, after 1965, when you have a large number of Middle East North Africans, this is, my analysis is from 65 to 2001, your phenotype played a big role in how you were treated. In other words, what you look like and your level of religiosity. So the more that you demonstrate your religiosity, which we kind of call as racial markers, then the more people are going to say, okay, that person's a foreigner. That person is not one of us. And then are they a dangerous foreigner or are they a good foreigner? Right? Will we allow them in as our guest or will we want to get rid of them? And again, that's not unique to Muslims. That's just immigrants' experiences as they come. And so if you're wearing a headscarf, you're going to be presumed to be Arab. If you're white, if you're originally from England and you convert to Islam and you wear a headscarf in America, people will assume they will race you as Arab. And the reality doesn't matter. So the religious identity is already conflated with Middle East North African identity. And post 9/11, what I'm arguing is that we are all being treated the same in an adverse way. That religious identity now takes front and center to do the work, what we call the work of racializing, such that we could all be, some of us could be white presenting, some of us could be Arab presenting, whatever that means, where people see you and go, oh, you look like an Arab, right? Or you look like a Pakistani, or you look like a white person. But as soon as they know your religion and you're Muslim, that's it. Now you're an outsider. Now you need to prove individually that I can trust you, right? Individually that you're loyal, that you're a good American, that you're not supportive of terrorism, that you're not anti-Semitic, right? That you're not misogynistic. And if you can prove that, okay, then I'll accept you. But that just separate you from the stereotypes. The stereotype still applies.
Yeah, and I also think with the Balkans, it is a very interesting area also because a lot of today's white nationalists get inspiration from, say, like the genocide that happened in Bosnia. So Serbian nationalism has had a really massive impact on white nationalists in the US. We saw the white nationalist that targeted the Christchurch mosques. He had inscribed Serbian nationalists' names on his rifles and played Serbian nationalism music. So that region, I think, is very interesting in terms of looking at it from like a racialization aspect and that sort of stuff. So that is a very
nationalism of white supremacy.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a question that you actually do, you touch on your book, but we didn't get to. Conservatives often say that the colorblind society as in regards to black-white race relations, but progressives counter that and saying this overlooks the effects of structural racism. Would it be good for Muslims if they were treated in a colorblind manner legally and socially, or would this also be problematic for immigrant Muslims?
The problem with the colorblind narrative is it's impossible in a country where race is a master category. Maybe in another society it could be possible. I think facially it sounds utopic. And I don't think anyone facially would say that, oh yeah, we should go around discriminating against each other based on however we define race. The problem with the colorblind narrative is it is not possible. And therefore, what it does in effect when you adopt it is it perpetuates the status quo. And it says, I won't see color, and therefore I won't see inequality, and I won't see injustice, and I won't see inequity, and I won't even ask and interrogate the causes of such inequality. Because if I do, I will discover that a disproportionate number of people who are Black are in jail as compared to their population in society. A disproportionate number of people who are near poverty, right, are of a certain race or races. A disproportionate number of people who are wealthy are white, or a disproportionate number of people who are in elected office are white. That is not proportionate to their percentage of the population. So why is that happening? Well, the racist response is because there's something inferior about those people. They deserve it. They did something wrong. That's the colorblind response. The anti-racist response is the system is flawed. There is something wrong with the system because, and I'm an attorney and I'm a law professor, I can create rules that are facially neutral that will create racist outcomes or sexist outcomes. That's easy. And so if you think, oh, if I just see it and it doesn't say, you can't do this because you're Black, then we're not racist. But I can find ways to figure out proxies, right, based on geography, based on wealth or income, education levels, things that are facially neutral, but I know that there's concentrations of certain demographics that fit these categories, and then I can make rules that give opportunities to some groups and deny opportunities to others. And that's why the colorblind narrative is a complete, it's flawed. It doesn't work. It perpetuates racism. And it is not coincidentally followed by people who are in the privileged classes, who are benefiting from the status quo and see no reason why we should challenge the system. If you are winning in the system, whatever that system is, you have no incentive to change it. But if you're losing in a system, you do have an incentive to change it. And then the question is, can you change it? Will you change it? Are you willing to pay the price of trying to change it and possibly losing? And when I say system, it can be any system. We can go as granular as how you get admitted to law school, how you get admitted to college, how grades are, who is considered, how performance evaluations at work are conducted. So there are systems and micro and macro systems. And so the colorblind approach just says we're not even going to ask those questions because we are starting on the assumption that there's no racism in America, that we are a pure meritocracy, and everybody has what they deserve.
Fantastic. One last, we have about 10 minutes. And I think this is very interesting. And you talk about this quite a bit in your book early on when you're talking about the immigrant experience, the experiences of Arab Christians. And you touched on this when you talked about immigrants coming from the Levant in the early 20th century. How did theirs factor into America's racio-religious hierarchy?
So when you study Arab American history, so not Muslim American history, when you study Arab American history, it is primarily comprised of people who are Arab Christians. And I believe the numbers are around 60% in that range of Arabs in America that are Christian. So the majority of Arabs, people who are from Arabic speaking countries, whether immigrants, children, grandchildren, in America are Christian. They're not Muslim, because that's another myth, that most Arabs in America are Muslim. Now, most Arabs in the Middle East are Muslim, but not here because of the immigration patterns. And it's a really fascinating history. There are multiple authors who have written entire books on this. Again, I cited in my book, Racial Muslim and Racism Quashes Religious Freedom. So I would encourage you to look at the bibliography. And I do have a portion of a chapter that's committed to understanding kind of how Arab identity and Muslim identity, how they converge and how they also diverge. And effectively, there were waves primarily economically driven, so not politically driven, not political refugees, but there were waves that were, again, we're talking 50,000 and 100,000, maximum they reached about 350,000 starting around the 1930s, 1940s. The exact numbers are in my book. But there are these waves of people that are from what is current day Syria and Lebanon and Palestine, which was at the time ruled by the Ottoman Empire. And the plan for them, they would bring their wares, they would bring things from the Syrian, the Levantine souks, the markets, spices, dishes, cloths, because there's a rich silks, there's a rich history there, a rich industry of all types of manufacturing. They would bring them with them, and they were peddlers. And at the time, peddling was a profession, it was a job, and they would go primarily to the Midwest, and they would go door to door. And they would have these backpacks, where they had these bags on their backs, which had all of their wares, and they would go and open it up and sell it. And the plan was, we're going to go to America, we're going to sell, we're going to make money, and then we're going to come back home, build a nice big house, invest in a business, and then we're going to stay. So oftentimes it was men that came alone. And like many immigrants who come here, most of them end up wanting to stay for various reasons. And so that's essentially what would happen is and then when they stayed, their brother would come, and then maybe their uncle would come. And once they decided to stay, they would then bring their families, right? Whether if they were already married, they would bring their families, or they would go marry abroad and then bring their wife and start a family here. And there really wasn't anything unusual about their experience until the immigration laws started to change. In the early 1900s, again, this is the beginning of this white nativist or Northwest European white nativism, and during the era of eugenics. And at this point, you have elected officials and people, elites, very worried again about the corruption of the American race. And they want to find ways to keep immigrants out that are not from Northwest Europe, and definitely immigrants out that are from Asia or Africa. And so these Levantines, Syrians, Lebanese, current day, they get caught in the middle because people can't figure out what they are. Because where does Asia end? Does it end in Istanbul? Or does it end in Iran, the borders of Iran or Iraq? What is the Middle East? And what would happen is they would go to court. So at first the reason it came up, their race, ultimately was because they wanted to naturalize. And you had to be white to naturalize by law. And at first it was not a problem, but then as they started changing the census, just to give you some context, and again, the details are in the book, there were 42 races in the Dictionary of Races. 36 of them were people from Europe. That's how racialized even European identity was. And that's why there were the Hebrews and the Slavs and the Iberians and the Teutons and the Anglo-Saxons. I mean, it was unbelievable. It was really telling about that era. And so they were trying to figure out, what are you guys? And the default was, well, they're Asians. Okay, you can't naturalize, you can't bring your family here, you can't immigrate new people here because of the anti-Asian exclusion laws. And then they would go to court and say, no, you got me all mistaken. I am not a Mohammedan. I'm a Christian, and I'm Caucasian, or I'm Aryan, or I'm actually of European descent, we migrated. And they would literally point to their skin and their hair texture and their nose, and because they wanted to become citizens. They wanted to become white. And they were business people, so they needed to be citizens in order, there were laws in place in order to buy land or in order to start businesses or especially, and also to vote. And so there's a long history of them going to court. And again, I document that. There's another great book about that and the treatment of Mexicans called White by Law, Ian Haney Lopez. That's also a great book if you just want to study that issue. But again, it's not just Arab Americans, but it's how people, particularly Mexicans, but also Arabs, would go to court and say, well, we're not Black, we're white. And people in the courts were like, well, what are you? You know, what is someone that's from Mexico? And so ultimately, many of them, stayed, and some of them intermarried. Some of them just lost their identity altogether just through natural intermarriage. And then people continue to immigrate. But because the majority of people, of the population from Middle East and North Africa is Muslim, then by definition, anyone who's coming after 65 is going to be Muslim, right? But Christians are still immigrating. I think, but there is one thing that's a little bit troubling, which continues today, we saw post 9/11, is that Christianity, and this is part of the post-colonial mindset, or the colonized mindset, is that Christianity has always been associated with superior Europe. And so many Arab Christians have been themselves, there's a colonial mindset that by being Christian, they're superior to the Arab Muslims. And then when they come here and they face discrimination, especially post 9/11, because again, nobody cares. They conflate, right, the national identity, ethnicity, and religion. And they'll say, oh, I'm Christian. Treat the Muslims badly, but don't treat me badly. And that is not the right answer. that is not the, it's ineffective, but it also perpetuates Islamophobia.
Yeah, this has been such a wonderful conversation. I hope everyone who's been listening in, I hope you really enjoyed it. Please do purchase Professor Aziz's book. I cannot recommend it enough. Again, like I said, it's not just about Muslims and Islamophobia. It is about American history, immigration history, the law. I think it is fundamental reading, especially in today's time where we have conversations or lack thereof about racism and white supremacy and structural limitations in society. So yeah, thank you for everyone for joining us. Thank you, Professor Aziz, for giving this amazing presentation. In the chat function, Andrew, our digital communications manager, has put in a lot of links for Dr. Aziz's book to purchase, her website. Also check out ACMCU's website and the Bridge website. And this will be recorded and will be posted to ACMCU's website for individuals who couldn't attend. But yeah, everyone, thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Aziz.
Thank you, Mubashara. Thank you very much. And salaam alaikum to everyone. May peace be upon you.
Bye, everyone. Have a good evening.